my wife was reading, she and I faced each other across the table, and she said, "You got to come over and look at this one. This is amazing." The story in short, this was a Union soldier. He was captured, sent to a whole series of prisons, wound up in Andersonville prison, starving like everybody else. They put him in the hospital there because he was so sick. Hospital was actually just lying under a tree, but it was called hospital. And for some reason, the commander there noticed he had good handwriting, so they made him a clerk keeping track of the dead. Well, roughly 50 prisoners died every single day. Just keeping track of the dead was a big job. So he had good handwriting, he was keeping this record, and he noticed the Confederates weren't doing a very good job. So he kept a secret record. He made the official one, then he kept his own list, which he stuck into the lining of his coat. When he got home, he had this record of the 12,000 men who were buried at Andersonville so that the families could know what happened to them. Went to the War Department, which is like the Pentagon today, and said, "Here's this wonderful list I have. I want to publish it in a newspaper to help the families who don't know where their loved ones are." War Department said, "Well, you did it on company time. It belongs to us. You can't even have a copy of it." He said, "Well, I've made a copy, an extra copy." They say, "Give us all your copies or you go to prison." So he said, "I'm keeping one." So they put him in prison. They sent him to Albany State Prison for 18 months at hard labor.
Amazing.
When they sent him up with hard labor, he still had diarrhea, malaria, and diphtheria. But he'd made some friends. He made friends with Clara Barton, who started the Red Cross. He made friends with Benjamin Butler, who was a big-time politician and general. They got him out of prison. They wanted to get him out of circulation, out of the bad air of Washington, D.C., which is political as always. They got him a job in the Seychelles, which are islands off Kenya. He was there for a year. Then they transferred him to being consul in Tahiti. In Tahiti, he marries a Tahitian princess and becomes incredibly wealthy, starts all these plantations, starts a schooner line, pearl fishery. He and Robert Louis Stevenson start a steamboat line. And when he finally dies, instead of being this scrawny prisoner, he's fat, happy, and wealthy, and married to a Tahitian princess.
It's amazing. You can't make this stuff up.
No,
I mean,
I
it's
can't make it up.
Incredible. You're a doctor, and Civil War medicine has certainly gotten a very bad reputation. Deserved, undeserved?
Undeserved. I've read the examinations these guys had to go through. Well, first of all, we can see they didn't know about bacteria. Nobody knew about bacteria. They didn't have antibiotics. Nobody had antibiotics. But surgery, the examinations in anatomy, the examinations at how would you fix a broken maxilla. You know, a bullet hits the person and blows away the cheekbone. How do you operate on that? The guy's eye is hanging down. You can see his upper teeth, a big hole in his face. I mean, these people took on tough jobs. They did their best job. They were very well informed. People talk about biting on a stick, biting on a bullet during surgery. Nonsense. Both the North and the South had anesthetics. They used ether during the daytime, chloroform at night. That's because ether is explosive and they're operating by candlelight. They found that out quick enough. So most Civil War doctors were good. Now, there's bad eggs everywhere. In my little book on court-martial doctors, one of the issues was, when is a doctor too drunk to operate?
Tarnished scalpel?
Yeah, tarnished scalpels. And so the court-martial board had to decide if he was too drunk to be doing operations. Well, that's still a consideration. And there were all kinds of issues having to do with this. They had one nutty doctor from New York. The families would send all kinds of delicatessen things to the troops. He kept them in his tent until they rotted. He was just a nutcase. And so there's 50 different stories in there. Some of them were just administrative stories. Some were really surgical and medical stories.
But now, what was the criteria for becoming a doctor in those days? I mean, was it as rigorous as it is now, or was it
totally different? To go to medical school, you had a year of lectures, and the second year you went to the same lectures again. Most schools did not have any dissection of corpses, so you learn your anatomy looking in a book. Then after that, you generally apprenticed to a general practitioner in your hometown, followed him around and see what he did. When the war came, most people had done at the most 1 or 2 amputations. Out in the countryside, you know, the horse falls on you and breaks your leg and it gets infected and so forth. These guys with almost no practical surgical experience are suddenly sent off to a battle where the whole field is covered with people with terrible wounds.
Yeah.
It was a tough job, and they did amazingly well considering the lack of training.
Mm. Yeah. I guess the hospitals, they use private homes and, any large public building that they could, and obviously these aren't optimal for hospitals either, I imagine. And I guess the U.S. Sanitary Commission were volunteers, largely women, who came to assist more or less as nurses. So it was an interesting time, certainly around this area in the city of Alexandria. They had used the Episcopal Seminary as a hospital, which of course still stands today. And a lot of the large homes were taken over. The Lyceum in Alexandria was taken over as a hospital. Now, you'd mentioned before that a lot of the Confederate records were destroyed, and yet you've written a book called Confederate Death Sentences. How did you manage to reconstruct these records?
Well, it's like how do porcupines mate? The answer is very carefully. First of all, when a court-martial was finished, they gave it to a clerk who condensed it to one paragraph. And these were collected in things called general orders. And the general orders of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's thing, were saved because they had several copies. And then there was an enormous number of letters and diaries and so forth that said, I went down to the execution grounds and we saw these people being shot. Mm. And then many of the service records survived. And other researchers have gone through this. So what I did, with the help of many other people, was to assemble all of this in one place. So this is first interesting stories, but secondly, for future researchers who want to study this, this is where to go. This is where to find all the stuff.
And what would have been the most common reason for an execution in the Confederate Army?
Desertion.
Desertion.
Desertion, desertion, desertion. When you see pictures of Robert E. Lee, he looks kind of like Santa Claus, this kindly old Virginia gentleman. He hardly ever saw a death sentence he didn't like. He approved 95% of them. Mm. If you got convicted of desertion in Robert E. Lee's army, you got shot.
And what about in the Union Army? What would be the primary?
Desertion too, but the chance of being shot were down to about 5%.
And why is that?
It went through all kinds of levels of review, and in each one somebody tried to mitigate it. The Union Army steered away from death sentences.
But in the Confederate Army, you didn't have all those levels of review?
Well, they had some, but in general they just took them out and shot them.
I see. Interesting.
We've done the figures. In the Confederate Army, and now this is from memory, if you're convicted of something, you are 5 times as likely to be shot. 5 times as likely to be branded with a hot iron. 3 times as likely to be hanged. 15 times as likely to be flogged with a whip. This may have been related to the Southern culture, which had a lot of violence, a lot of dueling, mistreatment of slaves, and so I think more than the North, it was a culture of violence, and that was considered normal.
And did that accelerate as the war went on, I guess, as the desertion rate went up?
I'm not exactly sure. That's a good question, and I don't know it. More and more people deserted, of course. Some, went, to the gold fields in California where things were safer. A lot of them went back in the mountains, back in the hollows of Appalachia. Especially in the western section of North Carolina, there was not much enthusiasm for the war. That was kind of a planter's war. That was a rich man's war, and they left as quick as they could.
Now, one of the things the Southerners were always concerned about was that these invading Yankee hordes would, ravish the women. One poster said that the enemy is here for booty and beauty. Was rape, was that a common occurrence, and were a lot of people executed for that in the Union Army?